Okay, so in this video we're going to be talking about the relatively short paper introducing the idea of implicit bias from two people who have done some research about it. So the first thing that I wanted to do before I started off is that obviously this paper, this article, summary article, so this isn't a scientific paper like reading number 9 is going to be. This is them talking to a public audience of non-experts, you and me, about the concept that they have been actively researching. And so, of course, they have a particular viewpoint. They're very passionate about it. They want to advocate for that and educate the general public about it. But I think it's worth mentioning that though this is an active area of research, fairly new, it's not something that you would describe as well-established, settled science at this point. Though, as you can I think see when you visited the pre-activity for this reading, that they have a quite impressive array of those implicit association tests that are related to this phenomenon of implicit bias, and the number of tests that they've kind of generated to explore in different ways and to collect data from the general public. So every one of you who did participate in that in one of those tests added a data point to them. But the research that particular group has been doing, plus other researchers around the world have been doing, has been accumulating data here. But it really is still, in the grand scheme of things, pretty preliminary, and not. I don't think that there is yet consensus in the psychology community about this result. But that being said, it's very suggestive, but there do exist critics of both particular tests, like the one that you hopefully took and experienced, and other aspects of implicit bias and the related kind of concepts, features, and other experiments that people are using, which is all a sign of a healthy science when it's, experts talking to one another and criticizing their results, their methods, those kind of things, to understand the phenomenon better. So there are some particular criticisms. One is that the test results, so psychologists, because they do a lot of real-world testing in terms of surveys and other sorts of direct tests of abilities, behaviors, things like that, have all sorts of different concepts and language to use to describe the quality of tests, the accuracy of the results in certain ways. And we're not going to learn that stuff here. If you will take Psych 101, you might get some taste of those kind of things. They talk about validity and reliability, and both of those words are very specific words that mean very specific things in the context of psychology. But the general idea here is that there have been criticisms of the kinds of tests that you took as they're unreliable. That is that, and in the particular sense that I asked you to take one test, you got a particular result on that test, that tendency that the test revealed to you. The particular criticism that people have of those sorts of tests is that they think that if you took the test a second time, a third time, a fourth time, same test, and obviously there was no spoilers, like taking the test once doesn't spoil you from taking it again, just because it's not like now you know the answers, so now you can perform better on the test, right? Taking the test a second time is basically going to be the same thing as when you took the test the first time. The criticism is that when people repeatedly take the same test or the same sorts of test, that the results that you get, the score that you get on multiple runs of the same test, they wander a bit. They wander more than a lot of people are comfortable with. And so that can be an indication that the thing that the test thinks that it is testing for, it's either not testing for that thing very well. It's not very accurate at picking out the thing that it's trying to test for. So the results kind of wander around because it's not very good at pinning down where it is in you. Or that the thing that it thinks it's looking for actually doesn't exist, right? So if I design a test trying to assess some particular thing, which I assume exists out there, and I'm just trying to pin down how well you know that thing or how well you can do that thing, but such a thing doesn't exist, then it wouldn't be a surprise that my test isn't good at providing kind of a consistent number that characterizes your particular performance or your particular amount of whatever it is that thing is, because that thing doesn't exist, right? So there are some people who kind of who have doubts that implicit association tests, like the one that you took, are measuring implicit associations, because if they would, those people have arguments saying that if those tests actually were accurately measuring that kind of thing, that the variation in your test results wouldn't be as large as it is in some of these studies. So that's one thing to definitely keep in mind. It could be, as we collect tests, that this effect that these researchers think they found with an initial group of people just kind of fade away. That happens surprisingly common with lots of initial, what seem like really interesting results, is that they're interesting for a small group of people, but when you try and collect more data to try and refine the particular effect that you're looking at and get a better handle on it, that it just kind of dissolves away. It vanishes when you look at a larger group of people. The second kind of criticism that people have of this kind of research is that even if it is giving reliable test results, that is, even if there is a thing that these tests are testing and identifying in particular people, this implicit association that we have between one particular type of thing and another particular type of thing, that it is, even if it is showing up in the testing environment, they are skeptical that it actually is the same thing as what happens, as researchers or advocates argue is affecting people in the real world. So a perfect example of this is lots of you have lots of doubt about the value of standardized testing. You think, look, standardized testing tests one thing and I score pretty consistently on tests of standard exams, SATs, or what have you, right? So maybe they're reliable, that is, that they're measuring a thing, but the thing that they're measuring isn't the thing that the test makers think it's measuring, and they think they're measuring your intelligence or your potential to succeed in future education or something like that. And there's lots of skepticism among students, and I would say also among lots of profs as well and other people associated with education, that those tests, those standardized tests, actually do a good job at predicting future student success or graduation rates or things like that. And so that's the same kind of criticism that that some people levy against implicit association tests like the one that you took, is they'll go, okay, well, maybe those results are real and it's pointing to something in you that you do implicitly associate this with that. But they say, look, that's in a lab environment, in a test environment, and we haven't seen any powerful or compelling evidence that what's happening there happens out there in the real world too, that your revealed implicit association bias between this feature and this feature of people or circumstances is actually operating in the real world and affecting your decisions that get made in the real world in those kind of contexts. So with those two criticisms in mind, so you can have some justified skepticism about the results and about the sort of things that these two authors are claiming, let's dive in and try and understand exactly what it is that they are claiming is happening with their implicit bias tests. So the first key thing is the word implicit. Okay, so we generally have a good idea about what the word bias means. My next slide's going to talk about that. But it's really important to understand what they mean by implicit. Implicit is a fancy word basically for not obvious, right? Or not called out, right? And so the idea here is that implicit biases are things, are biases that we have, tendencies that we have that happen below the level of our conscious awareness. And so if you've read the Kahneman Two Systems of Thinking, reading, and or watched my lecture on that, you'll know that Kahneman talks about a system 1 and a system 2. And so this reading kind of links with that because I can use that language of system 1, system 2 to describe what's going on here. So Kahneman's system 2 is our conscious executive action mind, right? The one that we usually identify as us. System 1 is our subconscious quick reaction mind, and what these authors are talking about with implicit bias is they're talking about biases, that is associations that we make below the level of conscious awareness. So we tend to kind of associate one thing with another thing before we realize that we're doing it. And if we did realize that it was happening, right, then it's too late. By the time that system 2, our conscious executive mind, understands, wait, I'm jumping to conclusions, or I have this bias is happening to me right now, it's already passed you by, because system 1's really quick and system 2 is relatively, compared to system 1, really slow. And so system 1 has already made the implicit association, has already made the connection between those two features, and we likely have already made decisions based on or influenced by system 1's implicit association, and it's affected conscious decisions that system 2 has made. And by the time system 2 might become aware of the influence that system 1 has had on its decisions, those decisions are already made. So that's the implicit part of this, and that's the part that makes this really difficult to counteract, to compensate for, to fix. Now, the second part is the bias part, right? So they introduce briefly what they're talking about, a little bit vaguely, and they dive right into the resistance that they get from people when they start talking to people sharing their research about implicit bias, which is that it sounds an awful lot like what they're doing is directly accusing everybody, and they mean pretty much everybody, because they say implicit bias shows up in maybe slightly different forms in literally everybody, right? And so it sounds like, or you could interpret what they're saying as, basically, we're all racist. That every single one of us, no matter kind of what position, what kinds of conscious thoughts and commitments we have to particular values and principles, that there's some respects in which all of us are racist, bigoted in some fashion. And that's what part of why they wrote this article was, to discuss that objection and to give their response to it. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I'm not so sure that they made enough of a case against that and really described what they were talking about. They do say what I've got here on the slide, which is they say that implicit bias, the thing that they're studying, is just not about bigotry at all. So where do we get that idea? And if it's not about bigotry, right, then what is it about? What are they talking about? Because lots of the kind of popular examples of implicit bias seem to involve bigotry or racism, and so you get those as your examples of, here's implicit bias, here's where it shows up, and then you also add in the claim that everybody suffers from implicit bias. It seems pretty straightforward to conclude, well, I guess that means everybody's racist, right? They want to push back against that. They want to say, no, that's not what we mean. So what do they mean? What they mean is that implicit bias is the result of our basic human tendency to kind of sort people into groups, and that then our system 1, that subconscious processing that our brain does, uses those groups that we like to form and place people into and then the properties that we attach to those groups, that is the kind of the feelings or knowledge that we have about the typical member of that group, then becomes associated with the individual. Right? Once we associate the individual with the group, we associate the individual with all of the features, properties, characteristics that we have given to that group based on our previous experience. And we do all of that implicitly, that is below the level of conscious awareness, and we do it all super quick. So when they say that implicit bias isn't about bigotry, they're right. What the thing that it is about then is about this tendency for us to kind of sort people into groups and then make assumptions about individuals based on the groups in which we have put them. And we put them in those groups really quickly. We are judging books by their cover, to borrow a manner of speaking, right? And so when we're doing those judgings, and those judgings happen really quick, and then we base decisions based on the cover of the book that we think we are seeing without reading any of the pages on the inside, then that's what implicit bias is about. Now, that totally is compatible with bigotry. But what they're saying is, it doesn't have to be bigotry. You could have implicit biases, that is, associations between things that you make, pigeonholing people, right? Judging books by their cover, that don't have anything to do with racism or bigotry, right? Probably an implicit association that all of you have is that when you hear that somebody's a professor, you think they're pretty smart. Now, it's probably generally true, but you have been taught that through past experience and acculturation, right? You didn't ever decide to think or behave towards me as if I were intelligent consciously. You just kind of did that. Your system one, subconsciously, you hear, wait, professor, you start acting a particular way because your brain has made a quick and rapid and subconscious association between my job title and particular other features that you are assuming are typical of that group. That's just something that we do. And it's something that we do because we are not supercomputers. We can't think an infinite amount of things in a finite amount of time. These kinds of things, these implicit biases, these associations, are pretty much cognitive shortcuts. That is, we make leaps with incomplete information. We've been trained to do that. We have this tendency that these researchers remark upon because we have to make quick decisions based on incomplete information a lot of the time. And one of the ways that we manage to do that is to kind of make assumptions about people based on really preliminary information about them, really incomplete information about people. We leap to conclusions about all sorts of other things about these people or places or circumstances or things, whatever it is, because that's useful. It's useful. Now, it's not useful if those leaps are generally wrong, right? You have to have associations that are useful for you, that work out in real life, because if they don't, then you're going to get negative reinforcement. That is, you're going to get that taught out of you if it doesn't result in kind of good results. If those snap decisions that system one makes are in error, they don't lead to good decisions, and you become aware of that because the decisions you make kind of don't work out for you, then that will kind of change. You'll reduce that implicit bias that you have because they're not using them doesn't work very well, right? But generally speaking, the reason why these researchers say we all have implicit bias is because they're confident we all have the same kinds of brains, and all of our brains use cognitive shortcuts because all of our brains have been shaped by evolution to make snap decisions based on incomplete information. That's why they are saying that. And they're saying it's not necessary. They should have the word necessarily in there. It's not necessarily about bigotry because we make these biased assumptions in all sorts of circumstances about all sorts of people, but not just people, but things and animals and places and events and all that kind of stuff, because we just don't, there's not enough time in the day to read every book to figure out what the book is about, right? Sometimes you only have time to look at the cover. And if you sometimes only, and if most of the time, all the time and energy you have is enough to just look at the cover, then your brain becomes really good at sneaking peeks at covers, making decisions based on that. And then, if later on you have the time and the energy to actually crack open the spine and read some pages in the book, well then, okay, you're going to be updating your beliefs, but and maybe learning something about a particular person as an individual. But up until you do that, the decisions that you make involving that person are going to be predominantly shaped by those cover judging things that you did subconsciously without really being aware of them. That's what implicit bias is. Now, because of all that, lots of the things, and this is part of the kind of the practical fallout of this kind of research, lots of those properties and features of implicit bias and how it works and why it works in the ways that it does really undermine the kind of the most popular and obvious response to this kind of bias. And that is, it really isn't all that effective as a response to say, well, just, teach people that that this group isn't associated with this particular characteristic, right? That this group doesn't have this trait. Do that and tell people, like, hold a job training, hold a cultural diversity seminar or something like that, so that where you can just tell them and maybe show them data even, right? That no, actually these people are just as good at math, right? This gender is just as good at math as this gender is. And that just doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because of what it does work on. It works on system 2. That is, that kind of education works on your system 2, your conscious executive brain. But that's not the brain, that's not the part of the brain that is responsible for implicit bias, for influencing your decisions on the subconscious level. That's system 1. And that the intellectual knowing that a particular bias, a particular generalization that you have made about a group of people, or that you might make about a group of people, isn't valid, isn't accurate, isn't true, that's all well and good for system 2. System 2 is not going to make that mistake. But system 2 is not involved in implicit bias at all. System 2 is involved in explicit bias. That is, intentional racists, people who are, for an example, people who are consciously choosing to believe, based on data or evidence that they think is persuasive, that a particular group or race of people is less worthy or has a particular kind of trait. If they're consciously thinking that stuff, that's explicit bigotry. That can be remediated to a certain extent among willing people who are like open-minded enough to hear the data. That can be remediated by telling them, by showing them data and saying, hey, actually, look, this group of people just as good at math as this other group of people here, when you look at the data the way that you ought to look at the data. So there you go. And if that person is an explicit bigot or sexist about different genders' performances in math, but you show them the data and the data is, true and reliable and it's sufficient there, then, they'll change their mind. And then their system 2, their executive conscious decision making, will no longer be biased. But none of that touches system 1. None of that touches implicit bias. And the idea here is that really the reason why is that knowing is different than doing. And again, if system 2 is unbiased, suffers from no bias, but system 1 does suffer from these biases, then system 1 is going to have done its job. It's going to have influenced your decisions and your perceptions of an event before you realize it's done. So intellectually knowing that a particular bias is not correct, that it's inaccurate, that you shouldn't use that shortcut, it's too late. because it's already been taken if you have that implicit bias. And you might not even know you have it. That's the other limit of educating people about this stuff, is that if it's explicit bigotry, if it's explicit bias, then you're, at least to some degree, in some circumstances, aware that you are applying that bias as a filter to your perceptions or your decisions. But if it's a system one, if it's a subconscious effect on your decisions or your perceptions of a particular situation, then you don't know that you need the training, because you don't know anything's wrong. Your system 2 does not know anything's wrong. And system 1 doesn't advertise this stuff and say, hey, I'm going to make this outrageous association that is actually factually inaccurate, because system 1 doesn't think those kinds of things. It just reacts, right? So until you actually can detect in yourself, through outcomes, somebody calling you out, something like that, that you might suffer, that your system 1, your subconscious brain, might suffer from a particular bias, then you can't work on it. You can't try and remediate system 1 by some sort of education, which can't be this explicit sort of just give it more information, that'll fix it kind of bias, right? So it's a tricky problem to address. The thing that they mention in the article, which I'd like to talk a little bit more of, is what they think is, what they have identified, them and other researchers, as one of the most promising avenues to try and address this problem. And it has to do with anticipating this possible implicit bias and giving time and space for system 2 to notice, counteract, defuse the implicit bias that system 1 brings to the table, and or eventually do some training to rewire system 1, to give system 1 a different set of assumptions, or to remove those assumptions, those biases entirely. Because system 1 works really quickly and really efficiently, right, based on how it was trained in the past. No one's a born racist. No one is born with implicit associations of the type that we're talking about here. They learn those through particular experiences. So if we want to stop implicit bias, we have to relearn, we have to retrain and train out those biases and replace them with other biases, or with a more neutral perspective where no particular association is happening between this group and particular traits or characteristics, right? But again, all of that is limited on actually accurately diagnosing whether you have that bias or not. And it's really difficult on an individual level to tell whether you suffer from that bias or not. So it's difficult. The other thing that they're going to propose that seems to hold some promise is that you want to suspect, wait, my system 1 can go off the rails in these things, and, given our cultural histories and a cultural environment that most of us have grown up in, it's pretty reasonable to assume that I may suffer from those kinds of tendencies, from those kinds of implicit biases. So, but I can't be sure. It's difficult to actually pin down this stuff. The implicit bias test might have some reliability issues. I might not know particularly on the individual level that I suffer to X amount from these implicit biases. So another solution is just not really to assume that I do, but to compensate for situations and to avoid giving system 1 the opportunity to apply those implicit biases in the first place. That is, if I can avoid situations where system 1 makes that snap judgment that causes me, that influences decisions that I tend to make, and we change those circumstances to one where system 1 gets sidelined and it's system 2 consciously evaluating and deciding without interference from system 1, then we may not have eliminated the implicit biases in system 1, but because we've sidelined them, we've neutered them, we've made them irrelevant. And that could be good enough, right? And so another solution to that is to anticipate that, hey, system 1's going to tend to make me think this way, So before I get in any situation like that, or maybe while I'm in a situation like that, my system 2 should work hard to kind of pre-compensate for that bias. So for instance, it's windy outside and you're trying to throw a ball to your friend, right? You don't throw as normal because you know that the wind exists out there. You throw a little bit upwind and you let the wind carry it back to your friend, right? There's not very much you can do yourself to get in control of the wind. The wind's out of your control. Think of the wind as system 1, as your implicit bias, right? So the best thing you can do is voluntarily, with the things that are under your control, that is the system 2, is throw the ball differently so that it gets accurately to the place where you want it to get, even though it's continually under the influence of this particular environment, right? So I said stuff in the real abstract there, so I wanted to give a concrete example of how this might work. So there has been a study, probably by this time more than one study, because this one study was a little bit seminal and viral and stuff, and so I'm sure that there's been other psychologists, sociologists, other people trying the same kind of thing in different contexts to try and see if to see if the results of this study are valid in and larger kind of situations. But there's one particular study, and I've got the link down below of a news report where you can get links to this study plus other ones that they talk about, showed that when employers were looking at resumes, that when the researchers fed them fake resumes that had kind of identical stuff on, so I'd give an employer 2 resumes that I had made up or copied off somewhere else, and the only thing that was different between the 2 resumes was the name that I had attached to the resume, that actually there were differences between the callback rates, that is, the employers calling people back for an interview based on the resume that people had submitted as part of their job application. There was significant differences between the callback rates, and that was only based on the name attached to the resume, because everything else about the situations was identical. In particular, researchers found that if your name sounded black, that is, it had a kind of a distinctively black name, that it got more than 50% or more less callbacks than an identical resume with a name that sounded white or wasn't ethnically distinctive in any particular respect, right? And this could be evidence that lots of employers are secretly racist. That is, they're intentionally racist. They have explicit bias, but they're clever enough not to, wear a white hood and shout it from the rooftops that they don't think that particular racial groups are hard workers or capable of doing the work that they were advertising for, right? That's a possibility, and it's hard to figure out whether people are that if they don't give themselves away by their nasty posts on Facebook or Twitter or something like that. It's difficult to distinguish between secret racists and the effects of implicit bias, right? But we can give these employers the benefit of the doubt, maybe a little bit, and say, well, maybe some of them are secret racists, but that's a big effect, right? And when you ask these people, hey, they give all the right answers of not being secret racists, like they did take some effort to try and determine whether or not these people were secret intentional racists. Not a lot, but they did try some, and they kind of concluded we don't have a lot of evidence to think that this magnitude of an effect, and that's a big effect, is totally accountable by suspecting that some of these employers are secretly, explicitly racist and they just kind of hide it, but it shows up in callback rates for a job that they're looking to fill. So they suspected, hey, this is a real world example of implicit bias. And so this is something that ideally we'd like to remove. So should we now take these employers and say, you know what, you guys need to go to HR and you guys need to sit through a half-day's seminar on racism and implicit bias and things like that, and we'll have people wag their finger at you and say, you know what, people's names, even if they're unusual or unfamiliar or sound like they represent a particular racial group, you shouldn't let that influence your decision on whether to call back that person or not. Because that's not going to help. Because none of these employers consciously was aware that that was a factor in their callback rates. So how can we stop employers from being influenced without their own awareness about things like this? Well, one solution would be to totally redact the names of these people off of their resumes, off of their job applications, and give them numbers. So have a secretary, an administrative assistant, take in applications, redact things, start a file on each application, right? And have in the file somewhere where the employer isn't going to look it up, right? So that once you've kind of redacted all the names, you still know, you'll have somebody in the office who will know the real identity of that person, right? But then have the person who is making the judgment about whether this is one of the people who makes the short list who deserves a callback in an interview, make that person not know the name. This is blinding people, right? So you might have heard of scientific experiments where they talk about double blinding people. What they're talking about is removing effects like this, right? And so if we can blind employers to the names of the applicants, then we are sidelining potential implicit biases, right? And so then your employer could have strong implicit biases against particular cultural or ethnic groups, or they could have none, but by not telling them names at all, you're not giving that implicit bias anything to work on, and so everybody is much fairer. These decisions that employers make in this particular circumstance are much fairer. So that's a workable solution for this, at least in the short term, for that particular circumstance where implicit biases can influence somebody. You got to get a little creative with this stuff, right? Because you have to think first about, well, what implicit biases might be in operation here? How would they show up? What are they working on? Like, what is the material? What's the cover of the book that they're reading really quickly to jump to conclusions about the contents of the book? And how can we stop that really quick jump to conclusions from happening? How can we deny it the information that it uses to get started, while still making system 2, that conscious executive decision, still possible? This is a kind of a good example. An example in my own case is that often I like to know my students, but if I know you and come to know you, then that could influence my grading on particular assignments. So that could be bad. Or that could be good for you too, right? Because if I form an opinion of you based on our interactions, I could jump to conclusions about what kind of a student you are and how intelligent you are, or maybe I just know your major. It's online. I don't get much personal contact with you, right? But I have the class list and maybe I have your majors. And maybe my implicit biases work on that. And I'm thinking, people with traditionally hard majors, what are popularly conceived of as hard majors, they're going to be smart people. So if I grade something of yours and it's not quite right, maybe I give you the benefit of the doubt, but somebody who has a major that I'm not quite so impressed by makes the same mistake, and I don't give them the benefit of the doubt because I've associated them, and all that stuff's happening below the level of my conscious awareness. How do I solve that? Same kind of thing. I can redact names. I can make, when I'm grading things in Canvas, I can tell Canvas, hey, anonymize all of these things and turn them into student 1 and student 2 rather than attaching names to them. And so I will do that when I'm grading tests or things like that. But it's a judgment call, because if I don't know your name, then I can't explicitly, my system 2 can't relate the current thing that you're working on that I'm grading with past things that you've done, which might be something that's really valuable for me to remember. Oh, this is the person who made that kind of mistake, and now they're not making it. This is great. I need to reinforce that, right? Or they're still making that mistake that I thought I pointed out in the previous assignment. I need to kind of maybe be more explicit and use stronger language and really make a point to say, look, this is the second time you've made this mistake. We really need to fix this. And so there's lots of good reasons for me not to redact your names when I'm grading. And so I have to balance those things. right? And there isn't always a clear answer. This is tricky stuff, right? But it's this kind of thing that we need to be thinking about if we take implicit biases seriously and we want to try and remove them from affecting our decisions without us even noticing that they're doing that. So those are the thoughts that I have on this reading. The reading's pretty short. 40 minutes is kind of short for one of my lectures. I'm a bit of a blowhard, right? The next reading is on bullshit. So, topical. So get on that. That one's going to be interesting. That's more of a philosophical reading than a psychological one, like this one was. And I just thought I'd also drop in a random comment here. If you're the person who's charging through all the readings, if you're that kind of person, great. But I just wanted to remind you, there's a whole nother part of the course, about learning how to use rationale online with the listicles, and then subsequent to that, other more real-life arguments, whether they're out there on the internet or in your essay, that you could also be doing and scoring points. So I just wanted to remind you that stuff's out there. Don't ignore it. Make sure that you're kind of keeping up with that work, depending on your strategy and what counts as success for you in this course.